Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here tonight to interview a great artist and with whom I share a common interest about the cities, etc. So I'd like to start by talking about this idea of the degrowth. I'm sure that most of you, when we talk about the growth, you see it as a positive thing. I'm not sure that you're all happy to talk about the degrowth, but very often the growth is something seen positively by most of the people, the growth of the economy, the growth of the cities, the growth of the population, and therefore the growth of the consumption, which is very often extremely negative from an environmental point of view. So I'm very attracted by this concept of the degrowth, which is deconstructing what most of the people think about the growth. So I'd like to invite the artist to tell us a little bit more about the degrowth.
Yeah, so we are METASITU, and we are based in Ukraine, where we work mainly in eastern Ukraine with shrinking cities. So these are industrial cities that are losing population, where industry is closing. So when we talk about the degrowth in that context, it's involuntary degrowth. It's not something where you're growing and you're giving something up. It is a reality with which you have to deal and address. And of course, there is, especially when it comes to the urban planning, it's very difficult if you are in a position of city planner to think about or to propose or advocate for the ideas that would not involve growth, because it's politically somehow not really politically correct. And maybe you can tell the small accident anecdote.
I think the way we got into thinking about degrowth was we were doing a project in Mariupol, which is this city in the southwest of Ukraine, very close to the conflict area. And there we met the master planner of that city, who sits in that desk with the city behind her. You can see, I don't know, do we have a laser here? Well, anyways, you can see like the gray zones are like the steel factory. It used to be the largest one in the Soviet Union, and since '91, this city has been losing population at a rate of 10 people every day. So when we asked her, what is your vision for Mariupol in 2050? This very bright woman was like, oh, I hope it's there are a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of gardens, a very busy harbor. And we were, oh, something like Hong Kong. And she was like, yeah, exactly, something like that. And now, the reality is that Hong Kong will not happen in this part of Ukraine, at least within our lifespan, or by 2050. But why was she following that model? Why did she want to build a Dubai by the Sea of Azov? Like, why was this kind of like her developmental model when the city was actually shrinking?
So when we work in these cities, we are trying to somehow challenge the perception of growth, and we work with different tools like doing workshops through publications, where we try to address or basically shift the paradigm in the
Yeah, because I guess what I wanted to say is that the point is not that the problem is not that the city is shrinking. The problem is that we're not planning for that. And how do we do that? Because as architects, as you well know, Ghada, we are always taught at university on expansion and like tabula rasa, new zones, new infrastructure. But what do you do with infrastructure that is going to become a ruin? What do you do with infrastructure that gets outdated? How do you densify populations, or you don't densify populations? You have a lot more questions. It's a lot more complicated.
So basically, you are invited for shrinking cities and these concepts. How do you relate your work, what you've been doing in Ukraine, to Dubai's context, which is, I guess, in the complete direction of the degrowth? And how do you basically, what attracted you basically to come to Dubai and to do something here?
We were invited as residents for the winter cycle, actually just this winter. That's us with our fellow residents. But why we why we wanted to come in the first place, and our proposal back then also was about the degrowth, is that, okay, it might seem a bit counterintuitive to talk about degrowth in the city that is expanding and that has had such a incredibly fast urban development, but there are also vacant spaces in the city, and we looked in particular at vacant office spaces, which is something approximately 40%. And I think for us also doing this research with the degrowth, we understand that it's not only about places where that is reality that is going to happen, but it's also about thinking about the further futures of like resources, extraction, and so on, and what's going to happen. Eventually, these things, the kind of urban developments we are used to now, perhaps are going to slow down. So we worked on the project called Tower Fish Pigeon, where we explored what is called shell and core units, which are basically when you build a tower and before you give it to the new owner or the space, the office space, before you give it to the new owner, it basically looks like that in that little corner. It's just like a bare concrete with some basic infrastructure, and then when the owner moves in, they partition and make it look like an office space. But there are a lot of spaces like that. And we also discovered there are a lot of drawings that we worked with, left by workers, but also architects and engineers. And for us, it was important to give an access to space like that and to bring people there. And we did it through a partly fictional, partly non-fictional tour where we moved through different office spaces, telling a story about them that then culminated in an office pizza dinner at the top of the tower within the installation of Tower Fish Pigeon.
Would you tell us a little bit about your experience with Al-Serkal and Al-Serkal residency? Yeah?
Yeah, it was really great. I mean, doing something like this, I think would have been very difficult, and they were granting us space and extremely generous to like provide us with access to this type of building for the short time we were here. And I mean, now they've even allowed us to destroy a building. So I'm quite, it's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we were really happy to be here and have that discussion and have a really openness to talk about what does vacancy mean in a city like Dubai, how are ruins represented, I mean, where are they and how do we see them, or how people interact with them in Dubai. And I think it was like a really incredible experience that, of course, we formed our work right now, informed.
How did you basically get the idea to destroy Nadir Kuz, and how did you convince Al-Serkal team to do so?
Actually, Al-Serkal team convinced us to demolish.
Happens only in Dubai then.
Yeah. No, I think we were approached by Vilma Yurkute, the director of Al-Serkal, and she wanted for us to expand this discussion, and she suggested that we demolish the building of Nadia Al-Kuz in the center of the photo there. And of course, this just sounded also a bit crazy to us. We thought we really needed to be careful in terms of like how could we justify such an intervention and the type of dialogues that perhaps would trigger from that action. And I guess in our understanding or research, we came across, the Vilma actually wanted us to reconcile, is she here? Okay. She wanted us to reconcile the relationship with nature, and she told us, I just wanted to make Nadi how it was back then. And we said to her, it was back when? I mean, Nadi was a fairly recent building, and before that there was a marble factory, but in the 1980s, this was a piece of desert owned by Sheikh Rashid, who, in his deathbed, gave it away to Emiratis. And before that, 12,000 years ago, it was a wetland. And I mean, before that, I don't know, I wasn't born. But she wanted us to bring it back, and the question of like, what does back mean, and the idea of return is what kind of also triggered this notion of demolishing the building.
I mean, just will add that also we have a really expanded practice of thinking how things are built, and there is a lot of discussion of how things are built, but there is rarely discussion of how things are taken away. And it's not that, of course, they are taken away, and demolishing processes happen all the time to give a place for new developments or so. Of course, there are times when there are more discussion, but I think it was also very interesting for us to really think what does it mean to destroy or deconstruct the building.
Would you tell us about what you found out when you did excavate and started this work of deconstruction or creating the ruins, basically?
Yeah, this is really the process that just started right now, and this first digging process that we was making during this project is just giving an access for a public to see in this transitional process how the building was really before, and who was making, this is the perfect image to describe all these timelines of the project. So we were starting to research in this area as in one side, it was really interesting to see how all these soils are getting together. We had our first visit in September. We was visiting Soil Museum. We was visiting Universal Studios, Almaden Village. So we trying to we expected to find something, but we even didn't knew that we will find on this side you can see. We think it's foundation of a previous marble factory with the pieces of marble. Up of there, you can see also this big concrete slab that it's coming from the Nadi, from the Kalfi side, and with a big element on the top of this sculptural element. It's this hard future, this polystyrene and plastic that's always surrounding us everywhere. And it was the whole process of sculpting, discovering this space. We was working with 3D images, and but it was also about being present here for all the months to make this process.
You were mentioning that you were getting inspired by the follies. Would you like to explain the parallelism between your work and the concept of follies of the 18th century United States?
Sure. I think, in order to justify the destruction, I think we found two things that we found a bit interesting. One was the idea of the ruin in itself. I mean, we were commissioned to make a ruin, and we came in our research, we started looking at this, which is the visualization that John Soane made of the Bank of England. Actually, this was made by Michael Joseph Gandhi, his visualizer. So when he proposed the Bank of England to be built, he made two canvases of how the Bank of England would look when it was finished, and a third canvas of how the Bank of England would look 1,000 years after it was finished as a ruin. And this really, which sounds so banal, but to us really provokes a shift in the way we understand architecture, in the way we perceive space, because architects, as all of us here are, we like to think of our product as like this final element in a timeline, like it's finite. We really struggle to give up our kid into the world and like let it live a life on its own. And here, Joan's own was saying, guys, you know, this building is going to be sublime forever. But of course, this is not a coincidence, because at the time they were garden follies were very popular, in particular in Western garden tradition, and they were building grottos. This is perhaps a weird example, but like they were building grottos and Greek ruins and exotic pavilions. I mean, all of these were exotic elements that you couldn't find in the Midlands in the UK. And the way they were bringing these elements and building this completely, quote-unquote, unusable architecture is very similar to what's happened today in Global Village. But we thought it was very interesting, because for them, this idea of the ruin, of the Greek ancient ruin, which was so foreign yet so exotic and appealing, was something that they wanted. And for that reason, we thought that this was a good format to interact with. And what would it mean to make a 21st century ruin? We were not so interested in the exotic elements, and the exotic and cliched elements of the follies, which we try to translate here by bringing Brazilian graffiti or sand from Almadam or whatever. That's more like iconographic. But we're more interested in the type of discussions that start. I mean, these days, there's been a group of kids that have been coming every day to the installation to take photos and photo shoots and like this kind of very emo ways. And they were saying that this is the only ruin in Dubai. And I was thinking, no, Dubai is full of ruins. It's just that perhaps they don't fit with your understanding, or like this Western notion of the ruin that is completely taken over by nature or dilapidated with graffiti. It's just that we, of course, were playing so much with these elements that are very cliche in the terms of the creation of the ruin, that I guess they can relate to that.
Absolutely, yes.
But just also I would add that what was interesting for us with the idea of volley is that, even with that visualization made by Gandhi, it's the ruin that represents different scales of timelines. And this was also important for us in this project to look at the timeline of 5 years or 3 years, what Nadi was before 30 years, but also really look at geological time and 12,000 years when whole Gulf was a wetland. And the idea of ruin, or working with the ruin, creating it, allowed us to really converge all of them in one quite small location for that purpose.
When do you think a piece of architecture starts to be named a ruin, according to your researches and your work?
That's a really
Because I'm
great
sure there is a
question.
lot of, differences in opinions right here.
I think for a lot of architects, it starts the second their vision is not continued. That vector is changed, and I think they would think, oh, that's a ruined building. I'm pretty sure about this, actually. Like, I think the way, it's almost like when it's not following that vector, if we think of architecture as a technology in terms of like something that fulfills a function, I think as soon as it takes a different vector, I think that's when all this ruin discourse starts perking in.
Yeah, I think also it's like a space that it's so deliberate and there is no function. Like we was taking off this function of the building. We was erasing the function of this building it was before, and it's about the people to find their way of usage of this place. I think it's really important, and for that reason, it's even doesn't matter of the age of people. They start to be really, their behavior change in these type of spaces. And the way of interaction in the space, like not just the kids are running around, like even adults are like jumping in this island in the middle. I think it's so interesting to see how people's behavior is changing in this space that totally give you this liberty to be inside.
When do you think a ruin starts becoming a ruin, Ghada?
Pardon?
When do you think a building starts becoming a ruin?
I think it's very much linked with the decaying process. first, and of course the fact that it would be inhabited and abandoned. So these two components probably would make a building considered as a ruin. So,
But then,
it's not necessarily the aging or the timeline necessary.
Liv and I spend a lot of time in Athens, where we have a house, and we, there, for example, the Parthenon is like the epitome of the ruin, very present in the city, very much inhabited by a constant flow of daily tourists and buses and cruise loads of tourists, and very much maintained, to a point where there is no decay possible in the Parthenon at this point. Like, everything is so crafted and carefully maintained that I'm sure the whole city can go to waste, but the Parthenon would stay in its contemporary shape because it's under this process of maintenance.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, also like something that we discussed a lot, had discussed a lot during this project was that, the ruin is something that, doesn't produce value and doesn't have a function anymore, which of course is also not true, because also ruins can produce those things of, like a tourism or, excitement, or like the whole subculture of admiring ruins. Yeah, but it's it's an amazing question.
Yeah.
And how do you see the ruins in Dubai? I'm sure they won't look the same as other ruins in other countries.
Well, I think when we were going to these buildings for Tower Fish Pigeon, I think they were. I think these buildings could kind of be interpreted as ruins in many ways, because I don't know to what extent do these buildings fulfill the vision that the architect met or wanted. They're definitely decaying. For example, in this particular tower, the rooftop, the tiles were already breaking. But then, maybe they fulfill a vision that the owner wanted, which is one of financial speculation or using it as a financial vehicle. So instead of having it in the stock market, you can just keep on buying and selling this type of building, which has enough infrastructure to provide the illusion that it could be developed, but it may never be developed. So I think this is one of the ruins that we see here that is very pervasive, everywhere, ubiquitous. And actually now we're staying in the financial district, where in the IFC, and at sunset is really where these ruins come to your face, because everything is hiding this glass facade, but there are not enough lights turned on. And then you start seeing the voids in a lot of the city. There are also, of course, buildings that are very full and operating. And I'm not trying to say that these are unsuccessful buildings, because maybe they were built very successfully for that other mission. It's just that they're not inhabited. And maybe this is why we need to start thinking of these kind of infrastructures in new ways or fulfilling new functions.
Thank you very much for answering all these questions.
Thank you.
It's time if you have any questions in the audience that you would like to go through.
Does anyone have a question for METASITU or for Ghada?
Hi, hello. What was your favorite part of the process of deconstructing Nadia Goes?
I would think everything. No, it's the whole, I think the process itself was really incredible, and especially when we started to dig the ground, and every day something else would appear, and and then we discovered the foundations, and then something else comes up. I think it always felt like a kind of investigation in the building, or when we made a hole in the wall and you can really see, okay, this is how it was made, or yeah.
I think also it was interaction with all our workers. It was really unique. Without this kind of best people. It was impossible to build all those sand walls or making like super beautiful sculptural elements as a meteorite or cutting the holes in the ceiling. That last night we had a talk with one of our carpenter and electrician, and just before, like 24 hours before the opening, he was telling us, "Oh my God, it's the night when I can really understand the whole project coming together."
Yeah. And until that point, he had been like following orders without really understanding what he was doing, like or what was the vision necessarily. But yeah, I agree with you, Dan. I think this was a very interesting process, particularly because the site was so. We kept on like doing this team building, being like, guys, we're one team, because there were like different teams of construction workers that would like look down on how another team was building, stacking up the bags, or they were doing that. And this was also interesting, you know, like these tensions and how to resolve them. This was a very beautiful process. But I think in terms of the materiality of the building, this was super important, like what to do with all this waste, because we're trying not to produce so much waste, and or like doing all the calculations for the amount of soil that we needed for the walls. Yeah, I think it was a very interesting process that I was not trained at when I studied architecture at university, for sure, yeah.
We have some students here. I'm waiting for their questions.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Mathieu.
Yes, we spoke earlier today in
Yeah.
private, and some of the things we discussed, I know demolitions would normally evoke two sorts of emotions, maybe even more nostalgia in some cases and anger. Nostalgia in the sense that you have an emotional attachment to the pre-existing structures, and anger, which is usually the most overwhelming emotions. You have cities where neighborhoods have been destroyed to build new structures, and you always have people with those type of emotions. Now we have the luxury of seeing your project through the eyes of creative eyes, and how do we apply this to large architecture? Is it possible that would there ever be any time where we can have this sort of demolition exercises that does not evoke the kind of emotions we're trying to avoid?
I think that this is somehow the point, you know, like it was also like this building was used by a lot of people. 3 years ago, it was a beautiful cafe where people would come and work. So we were thinking about what is our responsibility when these people will come back and see the holes in the ceiling and the whole ground excavated. And most of them were quite, I mean, they were really happy about this transformation, that there was, as you said, no feelings of nostalgia. But I think that, I mean, just by creating a ruin in that area like Al Sarkal is somehow maybe implying that we can healthily live among the ruins, that they're just as important part of the city fabric as new buildings. And I think when we think about this, especially in the context where we work, there are a lot of demolishing programs that whose aim is kind of to densify city, but also not to leave ruins as something as it would be negative. So I think, you know, by slowly introducing the different, looking at the ruin maybe from a bit different perspective, it can, you know, familiarize to have it in your surrounding as like a normal object of the city.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah.
You asked them how do you define what a ruin is, right? What you've built is a ruin. How would you possibly see this play out? I don't know what Al Sarkal's plans are, but how would you see this play out months from now, years from now? What do you see, or what do you hope will happen to this space? And do you possibly have a fear that it could get ruined?
Oh.
And when I mean by it could get ruined, what I mean is, you have a certain vision for this ruin.
It's a maintained ruin.
Yeah.
Could that get ruined?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. This question is great, particularly because yesterday we were printing the maintenance manual on how to maintain a ruin. And like which lights to turn on when, how to take care of the plants and these things. I think it will remain a maintained ruin until January 25th. And after this, there are other plans that would further into March. But I think for me, the ideal scenario would be like to seal off that space and make it a total time bubble, for a few years, where absolutely under no circumstance, no one can access. A bit like, the DMZ between the two Koreas, or I don't know, or in Cyprus, that line where like suddenly this, or like at home in Ukraine, the exclusion zone around Chernobyl, where suddenly like all these forms of nature take back. And the thing is that I understand that this is maybe not a very interesting concept in the Gulf, because a lot of people would be like, oh, but nothing will grow here. But just because it's not vegetated, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's less, or, I think we can look at different forms of existence. But yeah, I think it would be amazing if we could seal it off maybe and let it completely decay, not maintain anymore, and just see.
Because I think that's why also we work with Polly here, is that it's like an accelerated ruinification process. It's a maintained ruin, so there is also a sort of irony of a ruin in that. And it is extremely interesting for us to think, so this is an introduction, there can be a ruin, but then what happens when it really becomes a real ruin that follows through its own processes completely independently from, somebody making it a bit polished.
You've also made it a great place for emo kids to take pictures.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. This morning.
It's another, almost like a stereotype of what we think about the ruin today.
But I actually think, that maybe the project, this is one thing that I'm really liking, the Instagram aspect of it, which I really hadn't thought about before. And I mean, even the other day when we were giving this tour, and this girl said, can this go on stories? And immediately flashed this light on us and was asking us to talk and to give this tour. And she asked about what was our hashtag. And for me, I was like, wow, the hashtag of the ruin. And that same night, a friend of ours invited us to her house for dinner. And as you entered in the compound's name was a hashtag. And I was thinking, wow, of course, it's like such an age where everything needs to be found or traced in Instagram, and where everything becomes almost like a stage. I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, I was just thinking, wow, I'm now at this person's house, and would I take photos of the dinner and put hashtag the compound? It's just so bizarre to me. Yeah.
The second option is to make it into a nightclub, which is also a sort of new comeback of if you think again about our home in Ukraine, where I'm not only in Ukraine, a lot of these industrial ruins repurposed for raves and nightlife. So I think that there's also that possibility, maybe an intermediate solution.
But we can already see by the public that are visiting our ruin that they kind of desire, and some aesthetic are just bringing them all together around it. But it's really interesting to see how it also grows inside, and how it's have this own life inside this ruin. This morning we saw a mushroom growing.
Yeah.
It was unexpected to see also how this small life is also happening there, even without us already.
But I mean, yeah, this is also interesting. I wonder, imagine if a developer was to take up this idea and just make staged industrial ruins as creative class hubs, imitating. Yeah, but maybe, yeah, and they are staged.
in Bombay, there's a lot of industrial mills that is converted into nightclubs and pubs.
Right.
All broken down places.
But already this
But-
area is like copying
but-
this industrial style.
No,
and,
sure. I mean,
yeah.
here, like, even this is like copying an industrial warehouse when it was never industrial. Like, it was just creative industry, like creative industry. But what I'm saying is, like, what would happen if, like, Meras was to build like brownstone, like, I don't know, brick building imitating, I don't know, some kind of like industrial area, like playing a lot with this aesthetic. Kind of a bit what we did here, because as I said, Dubai is full of ruins. It's just that people seem to be more appealed to taking photos here than I'm sure it's also a matter of access, and there were a lot of selfies being taken when we were in that building thing. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Any more questions?